At my wife's grandfather's funeral, my wife received his yacht, his penthouse, and his $27 million company. My wife handed me a small, crumpled envelope. From my grandfather, she said. Laughter erupted as I opened it. Inside was just a single plane ticket to Rome. Confused, I went. When I arrived, a driver held up a sign with my name. He said 6 words that made my jaw drop. You'd think funerals were supposed to be about grief, right? All somber faces, tissues getting passed around like appetizers, maybe some heartfelt speeches about how the deceased lived life to the fullest. Well, welcome to the Rockwell family circus, where even death becomes a goddamn business opportunity, and I'm apparently the opening act nobody asked for. So there I was, sitting in the 3rd row of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, because heaven forbid the Rockwells go anywhere that doesn't have stained glass windows older than democracy, watching my wife Clarissa dab at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Grandfather Raymond was laid out in a casket that looked like it could double as a luxury yacht, which honestly wouldn't surprise me given this family's obsession with showing off their wealth like peacocks in Armani suits. The pastor was droning on about Raymond's generous spirit and business acumen, but I could practically hear the slot machine sounds going off in every Rockwell brain around me. You see, this wasn't just any funeral. This was the main event, the Super Bowl of inheritance distribution, and everyone was waiting to see who'd hit the jackpot and who'd go home with the participation trophy. Then came the moment that would have made even Vegas bookies sweat. The lawyer, some ancient dude who looked like he'd been Raymond's personal legal counsel since the Civil War, stood up with a briefcase that might as well have had Pandora's box stenciled on it. He cleared his throat like he was about to announce the lottery numbers, and suddenly the church got quieter than a library during finals week. To my beloved granddaughter Clarissa, he began, and I swear I felt the entire left side of the church lean forward like they were watching the final play of the Super Bowl. I leave my shipping company, valued at $27 million. The applause that erupted was louder than the church organ had been during the entire service. I'm talking standing ovation, whooping, the works. Someone's aunt actually whistled. At a funeral, Clarissa's face went from fake grief to genuine shock to pure, undiluted joy faster than a NASCAR driver taking a turn. $27 million. Just like that. Because apparently being born with the right last name is a career choice in this family. But wait, there's more. Like some twisted infomercial from hell, the lawyer kept going. Also to Clarissa, the Manhattan penthouse on 5th Avenue. More applause. And the 90-foot yacht, Serenity. At this point, I was expecting someone to start throwing confetti, maybe hire a marching band. Clarissa was practically glowing, accepting hugs and congratulations like she'd just won an Oscar for Best Performance by a grieving granddaughter. Her brother Landon was already pulling out his phone, probably calculating how much he could borrow against his sister's new fortune. Her parents were beaming like they'd just discovered oil in their backyard. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there thinking about how I'd driven to this funeral in my Toyota Corolla, the same car that makes a noise like a dying walrus every time I hit the brakes. The same car that's held together by duct tape, prayers, and sheer stubbornness. The same car that Clarissa's family loves to mock at every family gathering, usually while standing next to their BMW collection. Then Clarissa turned to me with this smirk that I knew all too well. It was the same look she gave me when she forgot to invite me to her cousin's wedding, or when she told people I was between careers, instead of mentioning that I'm actually a history teacher. You know, like teaching is some kind of hobby I picked up between unemployment checks. Oh, Marcus, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Grandfather left something for you too. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, wrinkled envelope that looked like it had been forgotten in someone's jeans pocket through several wash cycles. From my grandfather, she announced to the entire church, because apparently my humiliation needed an audience of about 200 people, including distant relatives who'd crawled out of the woodwork for Inheritance Day. I took the envelope with hands that were definitely not shaking, absolutely not, and opened it while feeling every single pair of Rockwell eyes boring into me like lasers. Inside was a single piece of paper, not a deed, not stock certificates, not even a check for gas money, a plane ticket to Rome, coach class, middle seat. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I was looking at. Rome. As in Italy. As in the other side of the planet. as in a place that would cost me more money than I had just to eat a decent meal. The laughter started small, just a few chuckles from the back row, but it spread through the church like wildfire. Soon the entire Rockwell side was laughing like I'd just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. Cousin Bradley, who'd never worked a day in his life thanks to his trust fund, was practically doubled over. Middle seat, Marcus? Hope you're not claustrophobic. Landon wiped tears from his eyes and called out, "Hey, do you think they'll give you complimentary peanuts?" This sent another wave of laughter through the crowd, because nothing says family bonding like publicly mocking the poor relation at a funeral. I sat there, holding this crumpled ticket, feeling like the universe's favorite punching bag. $27 million for Clarissa. A penthouse that probably cost more than most people's houses. A yacht named Serenity, which was ironic since I was feeling anything but serene right about now. And me? I got a middle seat to Rome on what was probably the cheapest airline Raymond could find. No hotel reservation. No explanation. No nothing. Just a one-way ticket to a country where I didn't speak the language, didn't know a single person, and couldn't afford to buy lunch without maxing out my credit card. The really twisted part? This was so perfectly Raymond. The man who used to sit at the head of the table during family dinners, cutting his steak with surgical precision while making subtle digs about my adorable little teaching job. The man who'd ask me about my summer vacation plans, knowing damn well that teachers don't make enough money for actual vacations. The man who once gave me a gift card to McDonald's for Christmas, not as a joke, but as what he called practical. And now, even in death, he'd managed to turn me into the family entertainment. The relatives were still chuckling, already turning this into a story they'd tell at next year's Christmas party. Remember when Raymond gave Marcus that ticket to nowhere? Classic Raymond. But as I sat there, staring at this ticket that felt like both an insult and a mystery wrapped in cheap paper, something nagged at me. Raymond wasn't the type for random gestures. Everything he did had a purpose, usually involving making himself richer or someone else more miserable. So why Rome? Why me? And why couldn't the old bastard have at least sprung for economy plus if he was going to send me halfway around the world? The funeral was winding down now, people filing out to continue the celebration, because let's be honest, that's what this had turned into. Clarissa was already on her phone, probably calling her realtor to start shopping for an even bigger house. The Rockwell inheritance lottery had been drawn, the winners announced, and the losers quietly shuffled off to contemplate their participation prizes. I folded the ticket carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket, right next to my car keys and the $23 in cash that constituted my emergency fund. $23. In a family where people just inherited millions, I was worried about having enough money for gas to get home. As we walked out of the church, Clarissa linked her arm through mine in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to outsiders, but felt more like a victory lap. "Rome, honey," she whispered in my ear. "How quaint. I'm sure it'll be very educational for a history teacher." Yeah, educational. That's exactly what I needed right now. A history lesson courtesy of Grandfather Raymond's final fuck you from beyond the grave. While Clarissa's family was busy posing for what I could only describe as their new money Instagram photo shoot on the church steps. Seriously, someone had actually brought a professional photographer to a funeral, because apparently grief doesn't look good in iPhone selfies. I was trudging toward the parking lot like a man walking to his own execution. My beat-up Toyota Corolla sat there between a Mercedes and a Tesla, looking about as out of place as a hot dog stand at a five-star restaurant. The car had been my faithful companion for the past 8 years, which in Toyota years is basically middle-aged but still kicking. Unfortunately, still kicking meant that every time I hit the brakes, it made a sound that could wake the dead, which, considering we'd just left Raymond's funeral, felt a little too on the nose. The noise was somewhere between a banshee's wail and a rusty gate being dragged across concrete, and it got louder every month. My mechanic, Tony, kept telling me I needed new brake pads, but Tony apparently didn't understand the financial realities of being a public school teacher married into a family that thought my salary was cute pocket change. I slid into the driver's seat, and the familiar smell of old coffee, pencil shavings, and that weird car freshener I'd bought at a gas station 3 months ago hit me like a nostalgic slap to the face. This was my world. Not marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Not yachts and Manhattan penthouses. but cracked leather seats and a dashboard held together with electrical tape because the glue on the original covering had given up sometime during the Obama administration. As I turned the key, the engine coughed to life with all the enthusiasm of a chain smoker getting up for their morning jog. Through the windshield, I could see Clarissa posing next to what I assumed was her new family of millionaires. Her smile, so bright it could probably be seen from space. She looked like she'd just won the lottery, which, let's be honest, she basically had. $27 million. The number kept bouncing around in my head like a ping-pong ball in a wind tunnel. I teach history at Roosevelt High School, which sounds more prestigious than it actually is until you realize it's named after Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin, and the building was probably constructed when Teddy was still charging up San Juan Hill. The school has that special combination of broken dreams and industrial-strength floor cleaner that all public schools seem to marinate in. My classroom is on the 3rd floor, and the radiator makes noises that could be Morse code from ghosts of students past. But here's the thing about teaching. It's not just a job. It's basically a lifestyle choice that says, hey world, I'd like to make just enough money to afford rent and frozen pizza, with occasional splurges on name-brand cereal when I'm feeling financially reckless. The Rockwells never let me forget this, of course. Every family gathering was like a masterclass in passive-aggressive wealth shaming. "Oh, Marcus," Clarissa's mother would say while sipping wine that cost more than my monthly car payment, "still teaching? How noble. Don't you ever think about doing something more ambitious?" By ambitious, she meant profitable. By noble, she meant pathetic. The translation was always crystal clear. Her father was even worse. He'd corner me at Christmas parties and ask questions like, "So, what's your 5-year plan?" As if teaching high schoolers about the Revolutionary War was some kind of stepping stone to a real career. "Have you considered getting into real estate? Or maybe finance?" "Yeah, Bob, let me just abandon my education degree and my passion for making sure teenagers understand how democracy works so I can flip houses and become another soulless money-grubbing clone in your family tree." The worst part was how they'd talk about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Poor Clarissa, she could have done so much better. "He seems nice enough, but really a teacher? Do you think she married him out of pity?" That last one came from Clarissa's Aunt Margaret, who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow felt qualified to judge my career choices. But you know what? Despite all their condescending bullshit, I actually loved my job. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a 16-year-old's face light up when they finally understand why the Boston Tea Party wasn't actually about tea, or when they connect the dots between historical events and current politics. Sure, I also dealt with kids who thought the Civil War was fought in the 1950s and others who were convinced that George Washington invented the telephone. But those moments of genuine learning made all the frustration worth it. Most days, anyway. Today was not most days. Today I was driving home from a funeral where my wife had just inherited more money than I'd make in 10 lifetimes, while I got handed what amounted to an expensive practical joke. The plane ticket was still in my jacket pocket, and every time I shifted gears, I could feel it crinkling against my chest like some kind of paper anchor dragging me down. As I pulled into traffic, my phone buzzed with notifications. Instagram, probably. I could already picture the posts. Clarissa posing with legal documents. Maybe a caption like, "Blessed beyond words, folded hands, hashtag grateful, hashtag new beginnings, hashtag yacht life." Her friends would flood the comments with fire emojis and congratulations, while I'd be tagged in exactly 0 of these posts because, let's face it, the history teacher husband didn't fit the aesthetic of newfound wealth. The drive home took me through 3 different neighborhoods that perfectly illustrated the economic diversity of our fair city. First, I passed through the area where the Rockwells lived. You know, the kind of neighborhood where the houses have names instead of numbers, and the mailboxes probably cost more than my monthly salary. Then came the middle-class suburbs, where normal people lived normal lives in normal houses with normal 2-car garages. Finally, I reached my neighborhood, which real estate agents like to call up-and-coming, but which really meant affordable if you don't mind that your upstairs neighbor practices interpretive dance at 3 a.m. My apartment building was a classic 1970s construction that had all the charm of a concrete bunker, but with the added bonus of thin walls and a parking lot full of potholes that could swallow small children. The rent was reasonable, the location was decent, and the landlord, Mrs. Chun, was actually pretty cool as long as you paid on time and didn't clog the communal washing machines with too much detergent. But sitting in my parking spot, looking up at the building I called home, I felt the weight of that plane ticket in my pocket like it was made of lead instead of paper. Rome. What the hell was in Rome? And more importantly, what was Raymond's angle? Because there was always an angle with Raymond. The man didn't even buy his morning coffee without calculating the tax benefits. I trudged up to my second-floor apartment, keys jingling like a sad wind chime, and let myself into the space that Clarissa's family liked to refer to as cozy, which was rich people speak for disappointingly small. It was a one-bedroom with a kitchen that could charitably be called efficient and a living room that doubled as my home office, complete with stacks of essays that needed grading and a desk I'd bought from a college student who was moving back in with his parents after graduation. The first thing I did was grab a beer from the fridge, not craft beer, not imported beer, just regular old American beer that came in a 12-pack and didn't require a sommelier to explain its flavor profile. I sat down on my couch, which I'd bought secondhand from a furniture store that specialized in gently used items, and pulled out the plane ticket. Rome. Departure date, 3 days from now. Return date, open. Which meant either Raymond expected me to figure out my own way home, or he didn't expect me to come back at all. Both possibilities were equally unsettling. I had 68 essays to grade about the Boston Tea Party, and let me tell you, after 8 years of teaching American history, there are only so many ways kids can describe dumping tea into a harbor before you start questioning your life choices. But someone had to make sure these kids understood that history wasn't just a bunch of dead people doing random stuff. It was a continuous story that led directly to their present moment. My phone buzzed. Text from Clarissa. Going out to celebrate with the family. Don't wait up. Clinking glasses. Right. Of course. Why would she want to celebrate her newfound fortune with her husband when she could party with the people who'd just watched her win the genetic lottery? I took another sip of beer and stared at the ticket some more. The logical part of my brain, the part that balanced checkbooks and calculated how many days I could survive on ramen noodles if necessary, was screaming at me to forget about Rome. I had responsibilities, bills to pay, a job that, while not glamorous, provided steady income and decent health insurance. Plus, what would happen if I just disappeared for however long this mysterious trip was supposed to last? Roosevelt High wasn't exactly known for its generous vacation policies. But then I remembered something Raymond used to say at family dinners, usually right before he'd steal the last dinner roll or make some cutting remark about my adorable little salary. He'd lean back in his chair, pat his belly, and announce to the table, "You know what separates successful people from everyone else? Successful people make moves that nobody sees coming." It was ironic, really, coming from a guy whose idea of an unexpected move was switching from scotch to bourbon after dinner. But sitting there in my cozy apartment, holding a ticket to a country I'd never visited, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Raymond's final gift wasn't the insult I'd assumed it was. After all, the man had just died, and his last act on earth was to make sure I got this ticket. Not Clarissa, not any of his other relatives, not his golf buddies or business partners. Me, the family disappointment. The history teacher who made everyone uncomfortable at dinner parties just by existing. So what was in Rome that Raymond thought I needed to see? Every single logical cell in my brain was having what you might call a full-scale revolt against the idea of actually using that crumpled plane ticket. I mean, let's be real here. I'm a responsible adult with a mortgage, student loans that'll probably outlive me, and a job that, while not exactly rolling in the dough, at least keeps the lights on and puts food in the fridge that isn't exclusively ramen noodles. The sensible thing to do was to frame that ticket as a conversation piece. Maybe tell the story at dinner parties for the next 20 years about how crazy old Raymond tried to send me to Rome like some kind of budget version eat, pray, love situation. But then again, when had being sensible ever gotten me anywhere with the Rockwells? I spent the first day after the funeral doing what any rational person would do. Making lists. Pro and con lists, financial impact lists, lists of all the reasons why hopping on a plane to Italy was certifiably insane. The cons list filled up 2 full pages of notebook paper and included gems like don't speak Italian, can't afford Italian food, will probably get lost and die in a Roman sewer, and my personal favorite, what if this is Raymond's final revenge plot, and I end up in some hostile-style torture scenario? The pros list was significantly shorter. In fact, it had exactly one item. Might finally figure out what Raymond's game was. But here's the thing about being married to a Rockwell. After 8 years of their passive-aggressive wealth-shaming and condescending comments about my adorable little career, I developed what you might call a healthy spite reflex. Every time someone at a family dinner asked when I was going to get serious about making money, every time Clarissa's mother sighed dramatically when discussing my potential, every time her father looked at me like I was a rescue puppy that never quite got house-trained, a little voice in my head started whispering dangerous thoughts about doing something completely unexpected, and Raymond's voice kept echoing in my memory. The best moves are the ones no one sees coming. Usually followed by him snatching the last breadstick. But still, by day 2, I was seriously considering the unthinkable. I pulled up my bank account on my laptop, always a sobering experience, and started doing math that would make my high school calculus teacher weep. If I cashed in all my accumulated sick days, which, let's be honest, I never used because teachers who call in sick just create more work for themselves when they come back, I could potentially swing a week or 2 off without completely destroying my financial situation. It would mean eating peanut butter sandwiches for the next 2 months and praying my car didn't need any major repairs, but it was theoretically possible. The really crazy part was that I actually had enough sick days saved up. 8 years of perfect attendance because I was either too dedicated or too paranoid about job security, probably both, had left me with a stockpile of unused time off that I'd never touched. Turns out being the reliable, never complains history teacher had some unexpected benefits. My principal, Dr. Martinez, was surprisingly cool about the whole thing when I called her on day 3. Blake, in 8 years you've never taken more than 2 consecutive days off, and that was when you had food poisoning from the faculty Christmas party. Take the time. Hell, take more time if you need it. We'll figure something out. I should probably mention that Dr. Martinez was the kind of principal who actually gave a damn about her teachers, which made her a rare breed in the public education system. She'd been fighting the district for better pay and smaller class sizes since before I started working there, and she had this annoying habit of actually listening when teachers had problems. The fact that she was practically pushing me toward the door should have been a red flag, but I was too caught up in my own spiral of decision-making to pay attention. So there I was on day 3, sitting in my kitchen at 6 a.m. with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at my laptop screen showing flight information to Rome. The departure was in 14 hours. 14 hours to decide whether I was going to do the responsible thing and go teach 30 kids about the Boston Tea Party, or whether I was going to cash in my adult responsibility card and follow a mysterious plane ticket to Italy like some kind of middle-aged adventure protagonist. Clarissa had been conspicuously absent since the funeral celebration. She'd sent a few texts about handling inheritance paperwork and meeting with financial advisors, which in normal person speak probably meant she was getting drunk on expensive champagne, while lawyers explained how to spend $27 million without accidentally giving any of it to her history teacher husband. Not that I was bitter or anything. The house felt different without her there. Quieter, sure, but also less judgmental. I could drink coffee straight from the pot without hearing about how civilized people use actual cups, Marcus. I could grade papers at the kitchen table without sighing comments about how some people get to work from home in their pajamas. Small freedoms, but freedoms nonetheless. Around 7 a.m., I did something that probably qualified as temporary insanity. I started packing. Not a big suitcase. I didn't own a big suitcase. Just a carry-on bag that I'd bought for a conference in Chicago 3 years ago and had used exactly once. I threw in some clothes that seemed vaguely appropriate for Italy in October, my passport, which I'd gotten for that Chicago conference and never used again, a phone charger, and about $300 in cash that represented my entire emergency fund. As emergency funds go, it wasn't much, but hey, at least I wouldn't starve on the first day. The really pathetic part was trying to figure out what to do with my apartment while I was gone. I didn't have plants because I'd managed to kill a cactus once. Seriously, who kills a cactus? But I did have a stack of mail that would accumulate, bills that needed paying, and about 68 essays that weren't going to grade themselves. I left detailed instructions for the substitute teacher, arranged for automatic bill payments, and asked my neighbor Steve to keep an eye on things. Steve was a good guy, worked nights at a warehouse, and spent his days playing video games loud enough that I could hear explosions through our shared wall. But he was reliable, and he owed me a favor from the time I'd signed for his Amazon packages when he was out of town. Plus, he thought my sudden trip to Italy was fucking awesome, dude, which was more support than I'd gotten from anyone else. The drive to the airport was surreal. Here I was, Marcus Blake, responsible adult and dedicated educator, driving to catch an international flight on what amounted to a whim. My car made its usual dying walrus noise every time I hit the brakes, which seemed appropriate. Even my Toyota was questioning my life choices. Airport parking was $22 a day, which meant this trip was already costing me money I didn't have before I even got on the plane. But I was committed now, or maybe I should have been committed. Hard to tell the difference at this point. The airport was exactly as chaotic as airports always are, but with the added bonus of being filled with people who looked like they actually belonged in international terminals. Designer luggage, confident strides, the kind of casual conversations about business trips to London or vacation homes in Tuscany that made my middle seat ticket to Rome feel even more like a consolation prize. Security was the usual nightmare of taking off shoes and hoping your belt buckle didn't set off any alarms, followed by the special joy of trying to fit your entire life into bins that were somehow both too small and too large at the same time. The TSA agent who checked my passport looked at me like I was personally responsible for all the delays in air travel, which was probably fair since I had no idea what I was doing. But then I was through security, sitting at gate B12, surrounded by people who were having animated conversations in what I assumed was Italian, holding a boarding pass for a flight that would take me farther from home than I'd ever been in my life. The departure board said Roma in bold letters, like the airport was personally challenging me to chicken out. That's when it hit me. I was actually doing this. After 43 years of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who never took risks or made impulsive decisions, I was about to get on a plane to Italy based on nothing more than a crumpled ticket and a growing curiosity about what Raymond's final game really was. The boarding announcement came in both English and Italian, and suddenly passengers were lining up like they were queuing for the last lifeboat on the Titanic. I found my spot in the middle of the pack, literally the middle, since I had a middle seat, and shuffled forward with everyone else, clutching my boarding pass like it was a winning lottery ticket. As I handed my pass to the gate agent, she smiled and said, "Have a wonderful trip, Mr. Blake." For a second, I almost corrected her, almost told her that this wasn't a trip, it was temporary insanity with frequent flyer miles. But instead, I just smiled back and walked down the jetway toward a plane that would either give me the adventure I never knew I needed or teach me a very expensive lesson about the difference between courage and stupidity. Either way, Raymond, you magnificent bastard, you'd finally gotten me to make a move nobody saw coming. Let me paint you a picture of what 8 hours in a middle seat feels like when you're sandwiched between a guy who brought what I can only describe as a tuna fish sandwich buffet and a woman who treated her armrest like it was sovereign territory in a disputed border conflict. By the time we touched down at Rome's Fiumicino airport, I felt like I'd been through some kind of endurance test designed by sadists who really understood the fine art of psychological warfare. The tuna sandwich guy, let's call him Captain Seafood, had apparently packed enough fish-based meals to feed a small coastal village. Every 30 minutes for the entire flight, he'd unwrap another sandwich with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a priceless work of art. The smell was indescribable. Imagine a fishing boat that had been left in the sun for 3 days. Then add the special aroma of airplane recycled air, and you're getting close. By hour 4, I was breathing through my mouth like a chronic allergy sufferer, and by hour 6, I was seriously considering whether jumping out of the plane at 30,000 feet might be preferable to enduring another tuna unwrapping ceremony. The armrest warrior on my left was a different kind of special torture. This woman had claimed both armrests before takeoff like she was planting a flag on conquered territory, and she defended her position with the determination of a medieval fortress under siege. Every time I tried to reclaim even an inch of space, she'd shift her weight and somehow manage to expand her territorial claims even further. It was like sitting next to a human octopus with boundary issues and a complete lack of awareness about shared airplane real estate. But the real kicker? The in-flight entertainment system was broken. Not just glitchy. Completely dead. Which meant 8 hours of staring at a blank screen while Captain Seafood conducted his tuna symphony and the armrest queen established her dominion over my personal space. I tried reading the airline magazine, but there's only so many times you can look at advertisements for duty-free perfume and articles about hidden gems in cities you can't afford to visit before you start questioning your life choices. By the time we started our descent into Rome, I was ready to kiss the ground, assuming I could still feel my legs after 8 hours of being compressed into a space that seemed designed for someone significantly smaller than the average human being. The pilot made some announcement in Italian that sounded cheerful, followed by the English version welcoming us to the Eternal City, which felt appropriately dramatic given that this flight had felt pretty eternal itself. Rome's airport was exactly what you'd expect from a major international hub: organized chaos with a side of espresso. The terminal was this massive, gleaming space that somehow managed to be both impressively modern and completely overwhelming at the same time. Signs in Italian, English, and several other languages pointed in every direction, creating a linguistic maze that would challenge even the most experienced traveler. Lucky me, I was about as far from experienced as you could get without being a literal child on their first airplane ride. I shuffled through customs with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no idea what they were doing, but was trying really hard not to look like a complete tourist disaster. The customs agent glanced at my passport, stamped it with the enthusiasm of someone who'd performed this exact same motion about 10,000 times that day, and waved me through without a word. Apparently, middle-aged American history teachers didn't register as particularly suspicious international travelers, which was probably fair. That's when reality hit me like a brick wall made of pizza and confusion. I was standing in an Italian airport, holding a carry-on bag that contained everything I owned for this trip, with about $300 in cash and absolutely no plan beyond figure out why Raymond sent me here. The smart move would have been to book a hotel before leaving, maybe learn a few basic Italian phrases, possibly research what the hell there was to do in Rome besides look at old buildings and eat carbs. But apparently, smart moves and Marcus Blake weren't exactly synonymous. I was standing there, probably looking like the dictionary definition of lost American tourist, when I heard someone call my name. Not my first name, my last name, pronounced with what sounded like an Italian accent that made it sound way more sophisticated than it had any right to sound. Mr. Blake? I turned around, half expecting to see airport security ready to escort me back to the plane for being suspiciously unprepared, but instead I saw him, a tall guy in a crisp black suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, holding a small sign with Mr. Blake written in neat capital letters. He looked like he'd stepped out of a movie about international espionage, all sharp edges and confident posture, the kind of guy who probably spoke 6 languages and knew how to tie a bow tie without YouTube tutorials. I pointed at myself like an idiot. That's me, the idiot with the coach ticket. Which was probably not the most dignified way to introduce myself, but after 8 hours of tuna sandwiches and armrest warfare, I wasn't exactly operating at peak social performance. The guy broke into this huge grin that completely transformed his face from serious international business to your new best friend who happens to dress really well. Excellent. I am Paolo. I have been waiting for you. His English was perfect, but with that Italian accent that made everything sound like he was personally inviting you to the best dinner party of your life. Waiting for me. I felt like I was in some kind of mistaken identity movie, the kind where the bumbling protagonist gets confused for an international spy and hilarity ensues. Except this didn't feel hilarious. It felt completely surreal. Are you sure you've got the right Blake? I'm just a history teacher from Mr. Marcus Blake, yes? Paolo interrupted, still smiling like this was the best part of his day. Married to Clarissa Rockwell, grandson-in-law of Raymond Rockwell, who passed 3 days ago. That's me, I admitted, though saying it out loud made the whole situation feel even more bizarre. How did this guy know all this stuff? And more importantly, who was paying him to know it? Perfect. Paolo clapped his hands together like he'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. Your grandfather arranged everything months ago. Come, I take you to the car. Wait, hold up, full stop. My grandfather? I practically shouted the question, loud enough that several other travelers turned to stare at the crazy American having what appeared to be an existential crisis in the middle of the airport terminal. My grandfather? Not Clarissa's. Paolo nodded like this was the most natural thing in the world. Yes, your grandfather. Raymond Blake. He called me in June. Make all arrangements. Very specific instructions. He gestured toward the exit with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that this conversation made perfect sense. But it didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Raymond Rockwell, not Raymond Blake. Clarissa's grandfather, not mine. The man who had spent 8 years treating me like an unwelcome guest at his own family dinners had suddenly become my grandfather? I think there's been a mistake, I said, following Paolo toward the exit because standing still in confusion wasn't getting me anywhere, and at least walking in confusion felt like progress. Raymond wasn't my grandfather. He was my wife's grandfather. Raymond Rockwell. You know, shipping company, Manhattan penthouse, general asshole with a superiority complex. Paolo stopped walking and turned to look at me with an expression that was part amusement, part pity, and part something that looked suspiciously like relief. Mr. Blake, he said, his voice gentle but firm. I think perhaps you do not know the whole story about your family, yes? The whole story about my family. What the hell was that supposed to mean? My family story was pretty straightforward. Working-class parents, decent upbringing in a small town, college on student loans, teaching career, marriage to someone way out of my financial league. Not exactly the kind of family history that typically involved mysterious Italian drivers and international intrigue. What story? I asked, though I was starting to get the feeling that whatever Paolo was about to tell me was going to turn my understanding of everything upside down. My parents are Ruth and David Blake from Ohio. My dad sold insurance. My mom worked at the post office. We're not exactly the kind of people who have mysterious European connections. Paolo's smile got even bigger, if that was possible. Come, Mr. Blake. We have much to discuss, and the car is more comfortable than airport terminal for such conversations. Your grandfather, your real grandfather. He explained everything in letters he left for you. Letters, plural, from my grandfather, who apparently wasn't the grandfather I thought he was, but also somehow was the grandfather I thought he wasn't, if that made any sense whatsoever, which it absolutely didn't. I followed Paolo through the airport in a daze, my brain trying to process information that seemed to contradict everything I thought I knew about my own life. We walked past shops selling Italian souvenirs, cafes serving espresso to jet-lagged travelers, and tourist information booths covered with pictures of the Colosseum and Vatican City. All of it felt like background noise to the main event happening in my head, which was essentially a complete system reboot of my personal identity database. The sliding doors opened, and we stepped outside into Italian air that smelled like diesel exhaust, coffee, and something that might have been herbs or spices from a nearby restaurant. The October weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with that crisp quality that made you want to take deep breaths and actually appreciate being alive. Paolo led me to a sleek black sedan that looked like it cost more than my annual salary, parked in what appeared to be a VIP area that definitely wasn't where normal people picked up their rental cars. He opened the passenger door with a flourish that would have made a hotel concierge proud. Please, Mr. Blake. We go to meet Isabella now. She has been waiting to see you for many, many years. Isabella. Another name I'd never heard before, but that Paolo said like I should definitely know who she was. At this point, I was beginning to suspect that nothing I thought I knew about my life was actually true, and somewhere in Italy, people had been waiting for me to show up and discover. What exactly? I got in the car, sank into leather seats that were probably worth more than my couch, and tried to prepare myself for whatever revelation was coming next. Because clearly, Raymond's final gift wasn't just a plane ticket to Rome. It was a completely different life than the one I thought I'd been living. Paolo drove like he was auditioning for the Italian version of Fast and Furious, which apparently was just called Tuesday Afternoon in Rome. I'm talking about casual speeds that would get you arrested in most American states, while having a completely relaxed conversation about the weather and asking if I'd ever been to Italy before. Meanwhile, I'm gripping the door handle like it's my last connection to this mortal plane, watching Italian countryside blur past at velocities that seem to defy both physics and common sense. First time in Italy, yes? Paolo asked, casually taking a curve that should have required at least 3 Hail Marys and maybe a last will and testament. His hands were relaxed on the steering wheel like he was driving through a mall parking lot, instead of threading the needle between trucks and motorcycles on what I could only assume was the Italian equivalent of a highway. Yeah, first time, I managed to say without my voice cracking, which I considered a personal victory. Actually, first time anywhere in Europe. Hell, first time anywhere that requires a passport and more than 3 hours on a plane. This seemed to delight Paolo enormously. Ah, perfect. Then this will be very special for you. Your grandfather. He always say you would come here someday. He was very sure about this. My grandfather. There it was again, that phrase that kept bouncing around in my head like a pinball hitting all the wrong targets. Because as far as I knew, my grandfather was David Blake Sr., a man who'd spent 40 years selling life insurance in Columbus, Ohio, and whose idea of international cuisine was going to the Chinese buffet on Sundays. He died when I was 12, and while I'd loved him dearly, he definitely wasn't the type to have mysterious Italian connections or elaborate posthumous plans involving plane tickets and drivers in expensive suits. Paolo, I said, trying to sound casual while secretly praying we'd survive the next turn. When you say my grandfather, you're talking about someone other than the guy who raised my dad, right? Because that would be really weird and also probably impossible unless there's some serious family secret situation going on here. Paolo glanced at me in the rearview mirror with that same knowing smile he'd been wearing since the airport. Mr. Blake, I think perhaps your family has many secrets, yes? But do not worry. Isabella, she explained everything. She has been waiting to tell you the truth for a very long time. The truth, right? Because apparently everything I thought I knew about my own family history was complete bullshit, and I was about to get schooled by some woman named Isabella who lived in Italy and somehow knew things about my grandfather that I didn't. This was starting to feel less like a vacation and more like that moment in movies where the protagonist discovers they're actually adopted royalty or their parents were secret agents or something equally ridiculous. We'd been driving for about 45 minutes when Paolo turned off what I assumed was the main highway onto a smaller road that wound through hills covered in what looked like vineyards. And I mean seriously covered. Everywhere I looked, there were rows and rows of grapevines stretching across rolling hills like some kind of agricultural art installation. The landscape was so perfectly picturesque, it looked like someone had photoshopped it to make Italy look more Italian than actual Italy. Beautiful, no? Paolo said, following my gaze. October is perfect time for harvest. Your grandfather, he always loved this time of year. Which grandfather are we talking about now? I asked, because at this point I was starting to lose track of how many grandfathers I apparently had and which ones did what. Raymond, of course. Raymond Blake. He built all this, you know. Start with nothing, make empire. Paolo gestured toward the vineyards with obvious pride, like he was personally responsible for every grape that had ever grown on these hills. Raymond Blake, not Raymond Rockwell. The name hit me like a slap across the face, because suddenly I realized what Paolo had been saying all along. My grandfather, not Clarissa's grandfather who happened to have the same first name. My actual grandfather, who apparently had a completely different last name and lived in Italy and owned vineyards and had somehow managed to keep his existence secret from me for 43 years. What the actual hell? Before I could process this revelation fully, Paolo turned through a set of massive iron gates that opened automatically as we approached. The driveway was lined with cypress trees that looked like they'd been standing there since the Renaissance, creating this dramatic tunnel effect that made me feel like I was entering some kind of Italian fairy tale. Except instead of a castle at the end, there was something that might have been even more impressive. A villa that looked like it had been carved directly from a travel magazine about most beautiful places you'll never be able to afford. The building was all warm stone and terracotta tiles, with ivy growing up the walls in exactly the right places to look romantic instead of neglected. There were fountains, actual fountains, scattered around gardens that probably required a full-time staff to maintain. The whole place radiated the kind of old-world elegance that you usually only see in movies about wealthy people with complicated family secrets, which, I was beginning to realize, might be exactly what I was dealing with. Paolo pulled the car up to the front entrance like he'd done this exact same thing 1,000 times before, which he probably had. Before I could even reach for the door handle, he was out of the car and opening my door with the efficiency of someone who took hospitality very seriously. "Welcome home, Mr. Blake," he said, and something about the way he said home made my chest feel tight. The front doors of the villa opened before we even reached them, and out walked a woman who made my breath catch in my throat. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and wearing clothes that looked effortlessly expensive in that way that only Europeans seemed to master. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped me in my tracks. It was her eyes. Brown eyes that looked exactly like mine, with the same little crinkles at the corners that I saw in the mirror every morning. She looked at me for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from jumping out of her body. Then tears started streaming down her face, and she stepped forward with her arms outstretched. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion and an accent that made my name sound like poetry. "I am Isabella Blake, your grandmother. My grandmother. My actual, real, living grandmother who apparently existed and lived in an Italian villa and knew who I was and had been waiting to meet me. The grandmother I'd never known I had, because as far as I'd known, both my grandmothers had died before I was born. She pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before, and I found myself hugging her back without really deciding to do it. She smelled like lavender and something that might have been vanilla, and when she stepped back to look at me, her hand stayed on my shoulders like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. "You look so much like him," she whispered, reaching up to touch my face like she was checking to make sure I was real. "So much like Raymond when he was young. The same eyes, the same stubborn chin." She laughed through her tears. "He always say you would come here someday. Always say his grandson would find his way home." I stood there like an idiot, trying to process the fact that this elegant, beautiful woman was apparently my grandmother, and that she'd been waiting for me to show up in Italy like this was some kind of predetermined family reunion. My brain was having trouble keeping up with all the new information, like a computer trying to run too many programs at once. "I'm sorry," I finally managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than I expected. "I'm really confused right now. I thought my grandmother died before I was born. Both of them. That's what my parents always told me." Isabella's expression shifted to something that looked like a mixture of sadness and anger. "Your parents, they tell you many things that were not true, I think. Come inside, caro mio. We have much to talk about, and the story is too long for standing in doorways." She linked her arm through mine and led me toward the villa entrance, Paolo following behind with my pathetic little carry-on bag that looked even more ridiculous in these surroundings. As we walked through doors that were probably older than my entire hometown, I couldn't help but think that Raymond, whichever Raymond we were talking about now, had managed to pull off the ultimate posthumous surprise. Because apparently, sending me to Italy wasn't just about giving me a vacation from my normal life. It was about introducing me to a completely different life that I never knew existed. The inside of the villa was exactly what you'd expect if someone had taken every romantic Italian movie ever made and somehow turned it into a real place where actual people lived. We're talking marble floors that probably cost more than my annual salary, frescoed ceilings that looked like they belonged in a museum, and furniture that was clearly older than the United States, but somehow still looked more elegant than anything you could buy at a modern furniture store. Isabella led me through what she called the main salon, which was basically a living room that could have housed my entire apartment with space left over for a small restaurant, and guided me to a couch that was undoubtedly worth more than my car. The whole place smelled like lemon oil and old books and something that might have been fresh bread coming from somewhere deeper in the house. "Sit, please," Isabella said, settling into a chair across from me with the grace of someone who'd been practicing elegant sitting for about 7 decades. "Paolo, could you bring wine? The Sangiovese, I think. And perhaps some of Maria's bread." Paolo nodded and disappeared through an archway that led to what I assumed were the kitchen regions of this palatial situation. Meanwhile, I sat there on a couch that was probably older than my great-grandparents', trying to wrap my head around the fact that apparently I had a grandmother who lived in an Italian villa and ordered wine like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I know this is very confusing for you, Marcus," Isabella said, reaching across to a side table and picking up what looked like a photo album that had seen some serious use over the years. "Your grandfather, he wanted to tell you everything himself, but—" She paused, her hands smoothing over the album cover. "Time. It run out too quickly, yes." She opened the album and turned it toward me, and I nearly choked on my own saliva. Because there, staring back at me from a photograph that looked like it was taken sometime in the 1960s, was Raymond. Except this wasn't the Raymond I knew. The stern, disapproving man who'd spent 8 years making me feel like an unwelcome guest at family dinners. This was a young, genuinely happy-looking guy with dark hair and a smile that reached his eyes, standing next to a woman who was clearly a younger version of Isabella. "This is your grandfather when we first meet," Isabella explained, her finger tracing the edge of the photo with obvious affection. 1963. He come to Italy for business. Something about shipping contracts, very boring. But he stay for love. She flipped the page, and there were more photos. Raymond and Isabella dancing at what looked like a wedding. Raymond working in vineyards with his sleeves rolled up and dirt on his hands. Raymond holding a baby that I suddenly realized might be my father. All of these pictures showed a completely different person than the man I'd known. Someone who looked genuinely happy and relaxed, and like he actually enjoyed being alive. "Wait a minute," I said, my brain finally catching up to what I was seeing. "If this is my grandfather, and you're my grandmother, then that baby." "Your father, Antonio," Isabella confirmed, turning another page to reveal photos of a little boy who had my dad's eyes and my stubborn chin. "Raymond, he lived here with us for 5 years. Best 5 years of his life, he always say." "Antonio. My father's name was David, not Antonio. Except apparently his name was actually Antonio, and he'd grown up in Italy with parents I'd never known existed, and somehow this had all been kept secret from me for my entire life." Paolo returned with a tray that contained a bottle of wine that looked like it had been personally blessed by Italian wine gods, along with glasses that were probably crystal and definitely cost more than I made in a week. He poured wine the color of liquid garnets and handed me a glass with the solemnity of someone performing a religious ceremony. "Salute," Isabella said, raising her glass. "To family found." I took a sip of wine that tasted like it had been made from grapes that had personally met every famous Italian vintner in history, and tried to process the information overload that was my apparently completely fictional family background. "So," I said, setting down my glass because my hands were starting to shake slightly, "let me see if I understand this. Raymond, my actual grandfather, lived here in Italy with you in the 1960s, and they had a son named Antonio who is actually my father David, and somehow none of this ever came up in conversation during my entire childhood." Isabella's expression grew sad. "Your father, he was very angry when Raymond decided to go back to America. Angry and hurt. He changed his name to David, refused to speak Italian, pretend this life never exists." She gestured around the villa with obvious pain. "When Raymond asked to see you, to tell you about your real family, your father say no. Always no." "But why?" I asked, because this whole situation was making less sense by the minute. Why would my dad hide all this? I mean, look at this place. Why would anyone want to pretend they didn't have family who lived in what's basically paradise? Isabella was quiet for a moment, turning pages in the photo album until she found what she was looking for. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, with a headline I couldn't read because it was in Italian. But there was a photo, and in that photo was Raymond looking older and more serious, standing next to a woman I recognized. Clarissa's grandmother, Eleanor Rockwell. "Raymond, he have to choose," Isabella said softly. "His family in Italy, or his business in America." Eleanor Rockwell, she have shipping contacts he need for his company. Her father, he owned half the ports on East Coast. Marriage to Eleanor, it mean Raymond could build empire. The pieces started falling into place like dominoes in a really depressing game. Raymond had married Eleanor Rockwell for business reasons, abandoning his real family in Italy to build the shipping company that would eventually make him wealthy enough to treat people like me with casual disdain. My father, Antonio/David, had been so hurt by his father's abandonment that he'd basically erased his entire Italian heritage and pretended to be someone completely different. "So he left you," I said, and it wasn't really a question. "He left us," Isabella confirmed. "But he never stopped loving us. Every year, he sent money. Every year, he write letters. And every year, he promised to come back." She reached across and squeezed my hand. "He never come back. But he send you." She flipped to the back of the album, where there were photos that looked much more recent. Raymond looking older but somehow more peaceful, standing in these same vineyards. Raymond at what looked like harvest celebrations, surrounded by people who were clearly treating him like family rather than an obligation. "He come back to visit after Eleanor died," Isabella explained. "Every year for last 10 years. He helped with harvest, He bring ideas for making business better. He always talk about his grandson in America, the teacher who marry into Rockwell family. She smiled at me with obvious affection. He very proud of you, you know. Very proud that you choose teaching over money. That hit me right in the chest, because in all my years of knowing Raymond Rockwell, I'd never once gotten the impression that he was proud of anything I did. Quite the opposite, actually. He was proud of me? I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. So proud, Isabella said firmly. He say you have integrity. He say you choose love over money when you marry Clarissa. Choose teaching over business because you want to help young people learn. He say you are best of both families. Blake Hart with Rockwell determination. Paolo had been quietly refilling our wine glasses, but now he spoke up. Your grandfather, he leave very specific instructions about when to bring you here. After the funeral, after you receive the ticket, after Rockwell family learned truth about their inheritance. Truth about their inheritance? I asked, though I was starting to get a very bad feeling about where this conversation was heading. Isabella's smile turned slightly wicked, and for a moment she looked exactly like the Raymond I'd known, the one who enjoyed strategic manipulation almost as much as he enjoyed expensive scotch. The shipping company, she said with obvious satisfaction. It have many debts Raymond hide very well. The penthouse, it have 3 mortgages. The yacht, it need repairs that cost more than the boat worth. She raised her wine glass in what looked suspiciously like a toast. Raymond, he leave Rockwell family beautiful disasters wrapped in pretty paper. And he left me. I prompted, though I was starting to suspect I already knew the answer. He left you truth, Isabella said simply. And vineyards. An export business that make very good money selling wine to America. She gestured toward the windows, where I could see rows of grapevines stretching toward the horizon. All of this, it belonged to you now. Welcome home, Marcus Blake. I sat there holding a glass of wine that probably cost more than my monthly rent, looking at photos of a grandfather who'd apparently spent years planning the ultimate revenge against the family that had never appreciated me, while my actual grandmother, who I'd just met an hour ago, smiled at me like this was the most natural thing in the world. Raymond, you magnificent, manipulative bastard. You'd played the longest con in family history. What do you do when you've just discovered that your entire life story was basically a work of fiction and you've inherited a vineyard empire in Italy? Well, if you're me, you apparently stay for 3 weeks and pretend you know what the hell you're doing while learning everything from grape varieties to export regulations from family members you didn't know existed until yesterday. The first morning after my world got turned upside down, I woke up in a bedroom that was probably bigger than my entire apartment back home, staring at a ceiling that had actual painted cherubs on it. Not kitty cartoon cherubs, but Renaissance-level artistic cherubs that looked like they were personally overseeing my sleep quality. The bed was so comfortable, I briefly wondered if this was what rich people felt like all the time, or if Italian beds just operated on a completely different level of luxury than American furniture. Isabella had breakfast waiting for me in what she called the small dining room, which was only small in comparison to the formal dining room that could probably seat the entire faculty of Roosevelt High School. The table was set with actual china, the kind with hand-painted flowers that probably cost more per plate than I spend on groceries in a month. And there was fresh bread that smelled like it had been baked by angels who specialized in carbohydrate perfection. Buongiorno, Marcus, Isabella said, pouring coffee from a silver pot that looked like it belonged in a museum. Today you meet Antonio. Right. Antonio. My father. Except not my father, because my father was David Blake from Ohio who sold insurance and had never mentioned having an Italian family or owning vineyards or speaking any language other than English and basic profanity. Antonio showed up around 9 o'clock, and the family resemblance was so strong it was like looking at a preview of what I'd look like in 20 years if I suddenly developed an Italian accent and learned how to wear clothes that actually fit properly. He was tall like me, had the same stubborn chin that Isabella had pointed out the day before, and when he smiled, it was like looking in a mirror that had been aged in Italian sunshine. Marco, he called out, which I quickly learned was the Italian version of Marcus, and pulled me into one of those European man hugs that somehow manages to be both completely masculine and deeply emotional at the same time. Fratello, brother, I cannot believe you are here. The thing about Antonio was that he treated my arrival like we'd been separated by some kind of tragic misunderstanding that had finally been resolved, rather than the fact that I'd had no idea he existed until yesterday. Within 5 minutes of meeting him, he was showing me family photos, introducing me to his wife Sophia, not to be confused with his daughter Sophia, because apparently Italian families really like reusing names, and explaining the daily operations of what he kept calling our vineyard. Our vineyard. Like I'd been an active participant in wine production for years, instead of someone whose idea of wine expertise was knowing the difference between red and white, and occasionally splurging on bottles that cost more than $8. Come, Antonio said, grabbing my arm with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting his entire life to show off the family business. Today you learn to be Blake Vintner. Tomorrow we start harvest, and you need to know difference between good grapes and... He paused, searching for the English word. Murta grapes. I was pretty sure Murta meant what I thought it meant, which told me everything I needed to know about Antonio's teaching style. The vineyard tour was like getting a crash course in Agricultural Sciences 101, except with more hand gestures and frequent stops for wine tasting that Antonio insisted was educational and very important for understanding terroir. By the end of the first day, I could allegedly tell the difference between Sangiovese and Chianti grapes, though I suspected my enthusiastic nodding was more convincing than my actual grape identification skills. You have good palate, Antonio declared after I correctly identified a wine as definitely red and probably Italian. Raymond always say you would understand wine when you come here. The second day, Antonio introduced me to his children, my cousins, apparently, Sophia and Matteo, who were both in their 20s, and treated my sudden appearance like it was the best thing that had happened to the family since someone invented mechanical grape pickers. Sophia was studying agricultural business at the University of Bologna and had approximately 10,000 ideas for expanding the vineyard's export market. Matteo was the practical one who actually knew how to prune vines and operate machinery and do all the stuff that kept the vineyard running while the rest of us stood around discussing bouquet and finish. Uncle Marcus, Sophia called out. And yes, hearing someone call me uncle when I'd just learned these people existed was definitely surreal. Papa says you are a teacher in America. You teach about wine. History, I corrected. I teach American history to teenagers who think the Civil War happened sometime after World War II. This delighted them both enormously. Apparently, having an American history teacher in the family was exotic and interesting, which was not exactly how the Rockwells had ever viewed my career choice. Perfect, Matteo said, clapping his hands together in a gesture that reminded me strongly of Paolo at the airport. You understand stories, yes? Every wine, it have story. Every vintage, every harvest, every bottle, all stories. He wasn't wrong. Over the next few days, I learned that winemaking was basically applied storytelling with agricultural science thrown in for good measure. The story of the soil, the story of the weather, the story of the year's growing season. It all went into every bottle, creating what Antonio called liquid history. Which, let's be honest, was way more poetic than anything I'd ever heard about teaching the Boston Tea Party to bored 16-year-olds. By the end of the first week, I was actually helping with the harvest, which involved getting up at dawn and spending the day in vineyards that stretched farther than I could see, picking grapes alongside workers who treated this like it was the most natural thing in the world. The work was physical in a way that teaching definitely wasn't. Lots of bending and lifting and walking through rows of vines while the Italian sun turned everything golden and perfect. And then there was the incident with the grape vat. Look, in my defense, nobody warned me that the platform next to the large wooden vat where they were crushing grapes was slippery. One minute I was leaning over to get a better look at the traditional winemaking process, and the next minute I was face first in about 3 feet of grape juice and crushed fruit, flailing around like a drunk tourist who'd wandered into the wrong kind of spa treatment. The entire harvest crew stopped working to watch me climb out of the vat, purple from head to toe and dripping grape juice like some kind of wine-themed swamp monster. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then someone started laughing, and within seconds the entire vineyard was erupting in laughter that could probably be heard in the next county. Benvenuto alla famiglia, Antonio shouted through his laughter. Welcome to the family. Apparently, falling into the grape vat was some kind of vineyard baptism that officially made me a true Blake Vintner. The story made it around the entire village faster than gossip at a high school reunion, and for the rest of my stay, people would see me coming and start grinning before making little falling motions with their hands. But here's the weird thing. I didn't mind. For the first time in 8 years of family gatherings, I wasn't the butt of a joke that was designed to make me feel small and unwelcome. I was the guy who'd provided everyone with a hilarious story that they'd probably tell for years, but they were laughing with me, not at me. There's a difference, and after years of Rockwell family dynamics, the difference felt like a revelation. The third week was when things got serious. Antonio sat me down with ledgers and export contracts and business documents that made my head spin worse than the wine tastings. Apparently, Blake Vineyards wasn't just a family operation. It was a legitimate international business that exported wine to restaurants and distributors all over the United States. Raymond, he billed this very carefully, Antonio explained, pointing to shipping manifests that showed regular deliveries to places like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Every year, business get bigger. Every year, profits get better. He always say this belonged to you someday. The numbers were staggering. Not Rockwell Shipping Company money, but definitely enough to make my teaching salary look like pocket change. Enough to pay off my student loans, fix my car, maybe even buy a house that didn't require 3 roommates to afford the rent. But I don't know anything about running a wine business, I protested, staring at documents that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to me. You learn, Antonio said simply. Same way you learn to teach. Same way you learn everything. Little bit at a time, with family to help. Family to help. For the first time in my adult life, I had family who actually wanted to help me succeed instead of family who seemed to take pleasure in watching me struggle. It was a revelation that hit me harder than falling into that grape vat, and probably left me just as stunned. It was exactly 24 days after Raymond's funeral when my phone buzzed at midnight Italian time, jolting me awake from dreams about grape harvests and family dinners where people actually seemed happy to have me around. The caller ID showed Clarissa's name, which was weird because she'd been maintaining radio silence since I'd left for Rome, probably too busy figuring out how to spend $27 million to bother checking in on her mysteriously absent husband. I answered the phone while stumbling around my guest bedroom, which, by the way, had better furniture than most people's living rooms, trying to remember what time it was back home and whether this was the kind of call that meant someone was dead or someone was in jail. Marcus. Clarissa's voice came through the speakers so shrill and panicked that I had to hold the phone away from my ear to prevent permanent hearing damage. Everything's gone. Everything's completely gone. Now, when your wife calls you at midnight screaming about everything being gone, there are several possible interpretations. Maybe the house burned down. Maybe she'd been robbed. Maybe she discovered that her new inheritance came with some kind of curse that turned money into dust, or something equally ridiculous. What I wasn't expecting was the truth, which turned out to be so much better than anything I could have imagined. What do you mean everything's gone? I asked, settling into the chair by the window that looked out over vineyards that apparently belonged to me now. The view was spectacular even in the moonlight, and I found myself wondering if this was what peace felt like, sitting in an Italian villa, surrounded by family who actually gave a damn about my existence, while my old life imploded thousands of miles away. The company. Clarissa sobbed, and I could hear what sounded like papers rustling in the background, probably financial documents that were telling her things she really didn't want to hear. Rockwell Shipping is bankrupt. Completely bankrupt. The lawyers say grandfather hid debts, massive debts, and now the creditors are seizing everything. I took a sip of the wine I'd been drinking before bed, a bottle of something Antonio had insisted I try because it was very special vintage, very good for thinking, and tried to process what Clarissa was telling me. Rockwell Shipping, the empire that had made Raymond wealthy enough to treat his granddaughter's husband like hired help, was apparently a house of cards that had finally collapsed. That's terrible, I said, and I tried to sound appropriately sympathetic while secretly thinking that this was the most entertaining phone call I'd received in years. What about the penthouse? Foreclosed, Clarissa wailed. 3 mortgages, Marcus. 3. How do you take out 3 mortgages on one apartment? The bank came yesterday and changed the locks. I had to stay at Mother's house, and you know how I feel about staying at Mother's house. I didn't know how she felt about staying at her mother's house. mainly because she'd complained about it for the entire 8 years of our marriage. Too small, too old-fashioned, too middle-class for someone with Clarissa's refined sensibilities. The irony was delicious. And the yacht? I asked, because at this point I was genuinely curious about how complete Raymond's sabotage had been. Repossessed this morning, she practically shrieked. The marina called and said men were coming to take Serenity away because of unpaid repair bills and dock fees. Apparently, the boat needed a complete engine overhaul that would have cost more than most people's houses. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. Raymond, you magnificent, vindictive genius. He'd managed to give the Rockwell family exactly what they deserved. Beautiful, expensive disasters that looked like generous gifts until the bills came due. Marcus, you have to come home, Clarissa continued, her voice taking on that manipulative tone she used when she wanted something. We need to figure this out together. Maybe you could get a second job, or we could sell your car, or... Actually, I interrupted, because listening to her plan my financial sacrifice to fix her family's problems was getting old fast. I'm having a really good time in Italy, learning a lot about wine. There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to appreciate the sound of Italian night birds outside my window. Then wine? Marcus, this isn't the time for vacation hobbies. My family is in crisis. Her family, not our family. Her family, which was interesting, because I couldn't remember the last time she'd referred to me as anything other than an obligation or a disappointment. You know what's funny? I said, settling back in my chair and enjoying the wine that probably cost more than Clarissa's last handbag. I'm starting to think maybe Raymond wasn't quite the grandfather you thought he was. What is that supposed to mean? Before I could answer, I heard another voice in the background, male, panicked, and definitely familiar. Clarissa, let me talk to him. Maybe I can reason with him. Ah, Landon. Or Preston. Or whatever his name was this week. Clarissa's brother, the guy who'd never worked a day in his life, but somehow always had opinions about other people's career choices. Marcus, man, you gotta help us out here, Landon said after apparently wrestling the phone away from his sister. His voice had that desperate quality of someone who'd just realized that his trust fund lifestyle was about to come to a very abrupt end. We know grandfather left you something. Some kind of inheritance, right? Whatever it was, we need your help. This was Rich. The same guy who'd made jokes about my complimentary peanuts at the funeral was now begging me for help like I was his last hope for financial salvation. He left me a plane ticket, I said truthfully. Middle seat. Coach. Very generous of him. Come on, man, don't play games. There has to be more. Maybe some kind of trust fund or investment account or something that we could all share. We're family, right? Family, right. The family that had spent 8 years making sure I knew exactly how little I mattered to them, how embarrassing my career was, how much better Clarissa could have done if she'd married literally anyone else with a more impressive bank account. You know what, Landon? I said, and I could feel a smile spreading across my face that probably would have terrified him if he could see it. You're absolutely right. Raymond did leave me something. Want to know what it was? Yes. Finally. What did he leave you? The truth, I said simply. He left me the truth about your family, and the truth about mine, and the truth about what happens when you build an empire on other people's money and think you're too clever to get caught. There was silence on the other end of the line, broken only by what sounded like Clarissa crying in the background and someone, probably their mother, asking loudly about whether they'd tried calling the insurance company. I don't understand, Landon said finally. I know you don't, I replied. That's part of the problem. See, while you guys were busy celebrating your big inheritance and making jokes about my travel accommodations, you forgot to check whether Raymond actually owned the things he was giving away. What are you talking about? I took another sip of wine and looked out at the vineyards that stretched toward the horizon, illuminated by moonlight and the knowledge that they belonged to me now. Real ownership, not the fake ownership that came with debt and mortgages and repair bills that could bankrupt a small country. I'm talking about the fact that Raymond spent the last 10 years of his life planning the perfect revenge against a family that never appreciated what they had. I said, he gave you guys exactly what you deserved. Beautiful, expensive disasters that would teach you what it felt like to lose everything. But what about you? Clarissa had taken the phone back, and her voice was smaller now, less demanding and more genuinely confused. Why would he do this to you two? He didn't do anything to me, I said. He gave me exactly what I needed. A family that actually wants me around, a business that's actually profitable, and a front row seat to watch karma catch up with people who think money makes them better than everyone else. Marcus, please, she whispered. I know we haven't always. I know things haven't been perfect between us, but we're married. Doesn't that mean something? And there it was. The question I'd been avoiding since the moment Paolo picked me up at the airport. What did our marriage mean when it was built on her family's money and their continuous reminder that I wasn't good enough for their standards? What did it mean when she'd spent 8 years apologizing for my existence instead of defending it? It means we need to have a very long conversation when I get back, I said finally. But right now, I'm learning about wine production and spending time with people who think being a history teacher is actually pretty cool. When are you coming back? Landon interjected. I looked around the room that had become more of a home in 3 weeks than anywhere I'd lived in the past 8 years. I'm not sure I am, I said. Turns out Italy's pretty nice when you're not worried about impressing people who are never going to be impressed anyway. And with that, I hung up the phone, turned off the ringer, and poured myself another glass of wine that tasted like victory and vindication and the sweet satisfaction of finally understanding the punchline to Raymond's ultimate joke. I flew back to the States 3 days later with more confidence than a tech bro pitching cryptocurrency to retirement homes. The difference between my outbound flight, middle seat, tuna sandwich neighbor, existential crisis about my life choices, and my return flight was like comparing a public bus to a private jet. Not that I was flying private or anything, but Antonio had managed to get me upgraded to business class through some kind of Italian airline magic that probably involved knowing someone who knew someone who had a cousin in the travel industry. The 8-hour flight gave me plenty of time to think about how I wanted to handle the Rockwell family implosion, and by the time I landed at JFK, I had what you might call a strategic plan. Or maybe it was just a really elaborate way to enjoy watching entitled people learn about consequences. But hey, strategy is strategy. I'd left my beat-up Toyota Corolla in long-term parking, where it had apparently spent 3 weeks collecting dust and developing what sounded like a new mechanical complaint. This time a rattling noise that suggested something important had come loose while I was gone. But driving that familiar squeaky, rattling piece of automotive stubbornness back toward home felt oddly comforting. It was like putting on an old jacket that didn't fit quite right anymore, but still had some sentimental value. The first stop was Landon's apartment, which was in one of those trendy downtown lofts that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. Except when I got there, I found him loading boxes into a U-Haul truck with the efficiency of someone who'd just discovered that his trust fund lifestyle had an expiration date. Marcus, he called out when he saw me approaching, and his voice had that desperate enthusiasm of a drowning man who'd just spotted a life preserver. Dude, thank God you're back. We need to talk, seriously. I've been thinking about ways we could pool resources, maybe start some kind of business partnership. I let him babble for a minute while I enjoyed the sight of someone who'd never done manual labor in his life, trying to figure out how to properly load a moving truck. His technique was, let's call it creative. Boxes were stacked in what appeared to be a completely random pattern, and I was pretty sure that antique lamp was about to become very unantique if he kept handling it like a bag of groceries. Where are you moving? I asked, interrupting his pitch about how we could leverage our combined assets for maximum synergy. Back in with Mom and Dad, he admitted, and I could practically see his soul leaving his body as he said it. Turns out when your entire income depends on dividends from a company that doesn't exist anymore, you have to make some lifestyle adjustments. This was beautiful. Landon, who'd spent years making jokes about my adorable little apartment and asking when I was going to get serious about building wealth, was moving back into his childhood bedroom because he'd never actually learned how to earn money that didn't come from other people's work. That's rough, I said, and I tried to sound sympathetic while secretly enjoying every second of this conversation. Have you thought about getting a job? The look he gave me suggested that I'd just asked him if he'd considered taking up professional fire eating as a hobby. A job? Marcus, I have an MBA from Wharton. I don't do jobs. I do consulting, strategic planning, business development. Right, I said. And how's that working out for you? He stared at the U-Haul truck like it had personally betrayed him. Not great, honestly. Turns out most consulting firms want to see actual experience, not just a degree and family connections. Who knew? Who knew, indeed. It was almost like the real world expected people to actually know how to do things instead of just talking about doing things in meetings. Well, I said, pretending to consider his situation seriously, I might have something that could help you out. His face lit up like I'd just told him he'd won the lottery. Really? What kind of something? A job, I said simply. Real work, steady pay, opportunity for advancement if you're good at it. What kind of job? He asked, and I could practically see him calculating whether this opportunity was worth swallowing his pride. Managing U.S. distribution for Blake Vineyards, I said, enjoying the way his expression shifted from hopeful to confused. It's a wine import business. Growing company, good profit margins, international connections. The pay is decent, not trust fund money, but enough to afford your own apartment if you're careful with your budget. Blake Vineyards. He looked genuinely puzzled. I've never heard of it. Is it some kind of startup? Something like that, I said. The thing is, it's a performance-based position. Salary only, no shares, no ownership stake. You'd be working for me, not with me. Think you can handle that? I watched him wrestle with the concept of actually working for someone else, especially someone he'd spent years treating like the family charity case. But desperation is a powerful motivator, and the alternative was explaining to his parents why their 32-year-old son was moving back into his teenage bedroom. Yeah, I think I could handle that, he said finally. When do I start? We'll talk details later, I said. Right now, I need to go see your sister. Clarissa was staying at her parents' house, which was a perfectly nice suburban home that looked absolutely tiny compared to the penthouse she'd been bragging about for all of 3 weeks. I found her in what used to be her childhood bedroom, surrounded by designer clothes and accessories that probably cost more than most people's cars, trying to figure out how to fit a Manhattan lifestyle into a space designed for a teenager. Marcus. She looked up from a suitcase that appeared to be losing a war against her shoe collection. You came back. I said I would. I replied, though I had to admit that seeing her in this context, surrounded by the remnants of her brief reign as a multimillionaire heiress, was both sad and oddly satisfying. How are you holding up? Terrible, she said, slumping onto the bed that was definitely too small for 2 adults. Everything's gone, Marcus. The penthouse, the yacht, the company, all of it. The lawyers say we might even owe money to creditors. Money we don't have. I sat down in the desk chair that had probably seen her through high school homework and college applications, back when her biggest worry was whether she'd get into her first-choice university instead of her second-choice university. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. Not sorry that karma had finally caught up with her family's arrogance, but sorry that she was going through the painful process of discovering that money doesn't actually make you better than other people. It just makes you more comfortable while you're being mediocre. The worst part, she continued, is that everyone keeps asking what we're going to do now. Like we're supposed to have some kind of backup plan for when your inheritance turns out to be a complete disaster. Most people do have backup plans, I pointed out. They're called jobs. She looked at me like I'd suggested she take up professional wrestling. Marcus, I have a degree in art history and 8 years of experience being a Rockwell. What kind of job am I supposed to get? It was a fair question, actually. Clarissa had never needed to develop practical skills because her family's wealth had made practicality irrelevant. She was intelligent and educated, but she'd never had to translate those qualities into anything that would pay rent. I might have an idea, I said. Blake Vineyards is expanding into new markets. We need someone to handle marketing and social media, someone who understands luxury brands and knows how to present products to high-end customers. Her eyes widened slightly. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to learn how to work, I corrected. It would be entry-level, but there's room for growth if you're good at it. The company does well, so there's potential for real career development. Blake Vineyards, she repeated slowly. Is that your company? It is now, I said. Turns out Raymond left me more than just a plane ticket. I spent the next hour explaining about the Vineyards, the Italian family I'd never known existed, and the business that had been quietly generating profits while the Rockwell empire crumbled under the weight of its own debt. Clarissa listened with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't seem to fit together. So you're saying that while we were celebrating our inheritance, you were actually inheriting something real? She asked finally. Something like that, I confirmed. Raymond played a long game. He gave your family exactly what you deserved. Beautiful disasters that looked like gifts. And he gave me exactly what I needed, a real family and a real business. And now you're offering to help us? I'm offering to let you help yourselves, I corrected. Big difference. Meanwhile, Clarissa's parents had been forced to confront the reality that their comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle had been artificially inflated by their connection to Raymond's wealth. Her father, Bob, who'd spent years asking me about my 5-year plan and suggesting I get into real estate, was now driving for Uber to help cover their mortgage payments. Her mother, Margaret, who'd made countless comments about my adorable little teaching job, had taken a part-time position at a boutique because their retirement savings had been tied up in Rockwell's shipping stock. The irony was so perfect it felt like Raymond had orchestrated it from beyond the grave, which, considering his talent for long-term manipulation, he probably had. But the real satisfaction came from watching them discover something that I'd known all along, that there's actual dignity in honest work, even when that work doesn't come with a trust fund or a family name that opens doors. Bob turned out to be a surprisingly good Uber driver. He actually enjoyed talking to people and helping them get where they needed to go. Margaret discovered that she had a genuine talent for retail sales and was actually good at helping customers find clothes that made them feel confident. They were learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that their worth as human beings wasn't tied to their bank account balance or their social status. It was tied to what they contributed to the world and how they treated the people around them. And my mother, Ruth, who'd spent 8 years being politely tolerated at Rockwell family gatherings while they made subtle digs about her son's career choices. She was living comfortably in the guest house at one of the vineyard properties, painting watercolors of Italian landscapes, and finally getting to say, "I told you so about Clarissa. I always knew that girl wasn't good enough for you," she'd said during our first phone call after I got back. "Too much money, not enough character. Should have listened to your mother." "Yeah, Mom. I probably should have." Now, 6 months later, I split my time between teaching American history to teenagers who still think the Revolutionary War was fought against Canada and running what has become a surprisingly successful wine import business that spans 2 continents. It's a weird life, but it's my weird life, and for the first time in my adult existence, I'm not apologizing for any of it. Roosevelt High School embraced my new dual identity with the enthusiasm of educators who finally had something genuinely interesting to talk about in the faculty lounge. My students think it's absolutely hilarious that their history teacher owns vineyards in Italy, and I've discovered that using wine production as a metaphor for historical processes actually makes lessons more engaging. Who knew that explaining the American Revolution in terms of terroir and vintage years would help kids understand the concept of cause and effect? "So you're saying the Boston Tea Party was like bad grapes affecting the whole batch?" asked Jennifer Martinez, one of my juniors who usually spent history class texting under her desk. "Exactly," I said, realizing that I'd stumbled onto something brilliant. One bad policy decision affects everything that comes after it, just like how weather during growing season impacts the final product. Dr. Martinez, the principal, not my student, actually encouraged me to develop a whole curriculum around this approach. Turns out that teachers who can make history relevant to teenagers' lives are worth their weight in gold, even if they occasionally smell like they've been sampling their own product during lunch breaks. The vineyard business has grown beyond anything Antonio expected when I first stumbled face-first into that grape vat. We're now shipping to restaurants and wine shops in 12 states, and Clarissa's marketing campaigns, featuring authentic Italian vineyard photos and stories about family traditions spanning generations, have been surprisingly effective. She's actually good at this work, once she stopped expecting it to come with a trust fund attached. Landon, meanwhile, has turned out to be a competent distribution manager, probably because for the first time in his life, he's doing work that actually matters to someone. He still occasionally slips into MBA jargon about optimizing supply chain efficiency, but he shows up on time, handles problems without whining, and has developed what might actually be a work ethic. "I never realized how satisfying it could be to actually accomplish something," he told me during our last quarterly review. "I mean, when people order our wine and they're happy with it, that's actually pretty cool." The Rockwell family's transformation has been fascinating to watch, like a real-time experiment in what happens when privileged people are forced to discover their actual capabilities. Bob turned his Uber driving into a small transportation business for elderly clients who need reliable rides to medical appointments. Margaret parlayed her retail experience into managing a boutique that specializes in helping women over 50 find clothes that make them feel confident instead of invisible. They're not rich anymore, but they're not miserable either. Turns out that having to work for your money doesn't destroy your soul. It just teaches you to appreciate what you earn. Every Sunday, I still play chess, though now it's sometimes with Antonio via video call, sometimes with students who've discovered that their winemaking history teacher is surprisingly good at strategic thinking, and sometimes alone in my apartment with a glass of Aretida, the special vintage Raymond left specifically for me. There's one unopened bottle sitting in my kitchen, labeled in Raymond's handwriting. For Marcus, who understood. I haven't opened it yet, because some gifts are too perfect to use. It sits there like a reminder that sometimes the people who seem to understand you the least are actually paying the closest attention. Clarissa and I are figuring things out. We're not the same people we were before Raymond's death turned our lives upside down, and we're still discovering whether we like the people we've become enough to stay married to each other. She's learning to value work over wealth, and I'm learning to value myself regardless of other people's opinions. It's complicated, but it's honest in a way our relationship never was before. The funny thing is, I still drive my beat-up Toyota Corolla most days, even though I could afford to replace it with something that doesn't sound like a dying walrus every time I hit the brakes. But that car has been with me through the worst parts of my life, and it seems wrong to abandon it now that things are finally good. The crumpled envelope that started this whole adventure is framed on my office wall at school, right next to a photo of me covered in grape juice and grinning like an idiot. Students ask about it sometimes, and I tell them it's a reminder that sometimes the worst things that happen to you turn out to be the best things that could have happened to you. Raymond's final joke wasn't the plane ticket to Rome. It wasn't even the elaborate revenge against his American family's greed and arrogance. The real punchline was teaching a middle-aged history teacher that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or social status. It's truth. It's family who actually gives a damn about your existence. It's work that matters and wine that doesn't come in a box and the knowledge that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you never saw it coming. And honestly, that's the funniest punchline of all.